I was captivated from the very first time I walked into Eric Hertz's workshop and just stood there and listened to one of the instruments being played. It was very much a visceral connection to the instrument. I thought, damn, I got to do this. And I was essentially waiting around for the muse of life to strike me. I was either going to, work in a restaurant for the rest of my life or do something worthwhile, something creative. And that I did.
Yeah. Right. So I'm starting about there. You just used one hand. Oh, and when you feel it, yeah, that is satisfying.
And then you just let it. Well, there you are.
That is very satisfying.
It is.
I didn't do a great job.
Oh, that's obviously a flawed piece of wood. The big workshops back in the 1940s and 50s and 60s were that the workshop of Hubbard and Dowd, who had a business together. They separated their workshops. They went to their own separate ways in 1959. And so Hubbard and Dowd became the two major builders of harpsichords. And in those days, they just had people beating their door down to try and get an order in less than 5 years. They had an employee at that time named Eric Hertz. And up to that time, Eric had actually been working with pianos, modern pianos, and was a very accomplished piano technician, actually. But Eric worked for them for he worked with Hubbard and Dowd for a couple of years and then went on his own later. And so Hertz, Hubbard, and Dowd were sort of the three big builders. That's the direct line of giants. The less direct line really goes back to the original builders, to the historical builders of harpsichords, and they in turn are related to the composers themselves and the musicians in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, because in a large way, the discovery of what makes a really good harpsichord came from the notes on the page. Hubbard and Dowd realized when they started off that the instruments that they were looking at, these revival harpsichords that were made in, I think they were started off being made in the 1890s and really began to be made in quantity in Europe in the early 20th century. And they were really just piano versions of a harpsichord. The piano companies would take basically their harpsichord frame, their piano frame, and cut it down to 5 octaves or so, and put a harpsichord action in it of various kinds, and try and make some sort of harpsichord sound out of it. But what Hubbard and Dowd realized is that the notes on the page didn't really translate well using those revival instruments. And they started looking at some antiques. There were very few antique instruments around in those days. So, restored antiques, I should say. So they started looking at whatever antiques they could find at the Museum of Fine Arts, at the Yale collection too, and tinkle around with those and see what made them a little better than these revival instruments. And it really started to build from there. There's this really a progression. I should not give Hubbard and Dowd way too much credit, because before them there was the very wonderful man named Arnold Dolmetsch, who started building again in the 1890s and on into the early 20th century, making really very creditable revival instruments. They really worked quite well. Other than that, there was the street that my parents lived on. A few doors down the street was this gentleman named Eric Hertz. And Eric was among other things, he was quite the sailor. And he and I got together over a mutual love of sailing. And he helped me build a sailing canoe in his workshop once. And just walking into this workshop, the angels wept, the stars collided. It was just absolute love at first sight. Everything about this workshop, it just smelled great, it looked great, it had all the nifty tools I wanted to play with. It just, it answered all my callings. I got to know Eric fairly well in 1970. I was actually babysitting for his 2 kids. And we got to talking. I went sailing with him a few times. And he offered me a job one day in June in 1971. And I had already just fallen in love with walking into his workshop, because it was such a great place to look around. As an apprentice in a workshop like that, you would first do the required job of drilling tens of thousands of holes in tens of thousands of tiny little parts of harpsichord action parts. And then you would also, whatever time you weren't spent drilling holes, you would just finish, do rubbed oil finishes on as many harpsichords as you could possibly stand. Just miles and miles of veneered harpsichords were. Eric at that time was making around 9 to 10 finished instruments a year. These are custom instruments. And he would make another 24 smaller instruments, half of which were usually sold as kits in partially assembled state, and the rest were finished up in the shop. And at that time when I started working there I became the 5th person in the workshop, and the employees, staff eventually got up to 9 people in around 1975, and he was putting out around 12 custom instruments at that time. There was always a lot of finish work to go on the custom instruments, and they just needed lots of hands. But in working for him, my apprenticeship with him wasn't a formal apprenticeship so much as it was just working for him and learning the trade, which is what you always have to do. And that is something that Eric was very good at, being very careful to point out, well, how do you use this, how do you set something up with a particular, in a particular method, so that there is a repetitiveness to it. You come out with your 10,000th part that looks exactly like your first part, and that is very important if you're going to make instruments successfully. So there's that attention to detail and the care and construction. Then there's also something that he was very good at, which was patience. And making any instrument like this takes a great deal of patience. You have to be able to withstand the inevitable mistakes that you're going to make and just go back and redo something, or just redesign something and go through the painful process that you did, X many years before. I can tell you a little tangent about patience. Here we go on the tangent. In the first year that I was working for Eric, one of his earlier instruments came into the workshop, and in those days he was actually putting the soundboards together. The soundboard is about, for a harpsichord, is about 1/8 of an inch thick, maybe a little better than 1/8 of an inch. But Eric would take 2 pieces of 16th inch Sitka spruce veneer and put a very, very thin layer of fiberglass cloth between them. This is fiberglass cloth that just feels, it's about as thick as a bed sheet. And he would laminate that with epoxy, and this would make an incredibly strong soundboard, which of course wouldn't shrink or swell with moisture. Okay, it also didn't sound very good. So when one of his old instruments came back in, he decided to put a new soundboard into it. And to do that, we had to sort of very carefully extricate the original soundboard. And he decided that what we would do is put the instrument up on its side, do a little surgery, cut something off, and then he would reach in here. He made a chisel out of a very long file, and he would place the chisel in there, in this little gap between the soundboard and the lining that it had been glued to, and we were just going to chisel that soundboard out of there. So he got me to stand there and gave me a hammer, and he'd sort of used his one hand to open up the gap between the soundboard and the liner, put the chisel down in there and say, okay, and then I would strike the end of that file with the hammer. You can tell what's going to happen. So we were going along fine for about the first 5 minutes, and then I came down and I smacked him right on the knuckles. And this is where patience comes in. I looked at him, he looked at me. Obviously, that must have hurt, but to my great surprise, I ended up working for him for another 5 years. And that little episode was quite the lesson. You've got to be patient with the people who work with you. End of tangent. Eric was making these transition instruments, which weren't classically designed. They weren't the classical model of instrument, and as such, they had a limited appeal to where the market was going. Eric was an older man. He wanted to do what he wanted to do. That's fine. I wanted to go where the market seemed to be, and that was towards these classical instruments. Well, my connection to earlier instruments is really sort of a twofold process. There is the actual the instruments themselves that as they were made, but there is also the music that they were made for, and these two things are really kind of inseparable. The music was written for a specific kind of action, and the thing about a harpsichord that's really inseparable from anything else, it doesn't matter how long it is, what color it is, how many flowers are on the soundboard. The action has to be just right in order for a really good player to be able to do some of these ornaments that you just don't find in other conventional music. Rachmaninoff, Brahms, Liszt, and Chopin are, that music was written for a piano, and that does, the ornaments that they were writing for, they work very well on a piano. You're not going to get that same kind of ornamentation on a harpsichord with Chopin and Liszt. For Couperin, you really have to have that very lightweight action. And to get that lightweight action, you have to use certain materials that have to have a certain thickness, a certain fallback weight to the keys. There have to be certain dynamics in there, or these little trills and mordents, these just breathtaking little affectations, grace notes. There is this wonderful term in French harpsichord music called notes inégales. And to to really make that music make sense, you have to have the original instrument there. When antique instruments started to be restored, well restored, musicians began to find that this music just really all of a sudden came alive. And that's when the real drive of the classically made harpsichord started to develop. Well, today's keyboard instruments, taken as a whole, divide themselves sort of into two different parts. There are the professionally made instruments, which are generally classical designs. They are antique-based, in other words. And then there are still kits that are being assembled by people that are being sold as finished instruments. So there are those two things. To be quite cold and cruel about it, you can't get a really good harpsichord out of a kit-made instrument. There are things you do in putting a kit together, and I've seen a few kit designs that are being sold today, and I'm pretty sure of what I'm saying here. They aren't made to make a successful classical musical instrument. They're made to be a successfully assembled kit. And what you get with a classically made, a professionally made instrument is something really quite different. In a classically made instrument, the entire instrument is made of solid wood. It's all solid wood. And they're put together with, animal glues, protein glues, and they are voiced in a certain way, and they have all the sort of corresponding dynamics that you would expect to find if you took apart a harpsichord of the 20th century and a harpsichord of the 18th century. They would be similar. In kit-built instruments, you quite often find plywood as being a part of the whole instrument, but if not, there are things that are just put together very quickly and cheaply. And unfortunately, that is not something that's made to last, and it can, you have joint failure quite quickly with instruments like that. With the earlier harpsichords that were made earlier in the 20th century, they too were assembled with plywood as part of the integral parts of the case. But still, there's a lot of musical instrument in there. They were based on very carefully drawn classical designs. In other words, Hubbard and Dowd's first instruments might have, plywood cases, but there's a real harpsichord in there. There is solid wood soundboards and so on and so forth. When I started off in the 1970s, the word copy of preceded every word harpsichord. You had a copy of the 1769 Tuscan. You had a copy of the 1776 Hemsch. Nowadays, you really don't have to do that so much. You can just say, well, I'm making a late 18th century French harpsichord, and the exact model that you drew your design off isn't so much important to people as what it sounds like, what it works like. And that, to me, is a tremendous relief. It saves a lot of words as you're introducing the instrument. But what differentiates my instruments from Hubbard and Dowd, I say, is probably not much, except that I am of that next generation of builders. So I had the advantage of being able to go to school on their mistakes, if you want to call them that. I wouldn't certainly call anything they did a mistake. But I was able to learn from what they did. I would quote actually something that Bill Dowd once said, and that is that he hopes that the instruments he was making would stand up well, and if in some afterlife, if there is such a thing, he were to meet an 18th century instrument maker, that they would look favorably on the work that he did in the 20th century. And I think that's sort of it. I would like to think that what I do will stand up well for time, both physically, the instrument won't fall apart, and that musically, it's still going to be relevant to people X many years down the pike, the way a well-restored antique is. Your question of how many harpsichord builders there are in Boston is an interesting one. Right now, I think I'm the only one. But when I started off my own workshop in 1977, I became the 9th person to hang out their shingle as a builder of early keyboard instruments. And 9th person in Greater Boston, I should say. I think I stopped taking orders about 3 years ago. And I have a couple of legacy orders that I don't know if I'm ever going to actually make those. But I have enough rebuilding work coming in that is enough to keep me busy. One thing I'm really fanatical about is the idea of having workshop training and a workshop method where you're not really doing something by the seat of your pants. You're doing something that you can do repetitively. You can do something the first time and the 700th time and the 7,000th time the same way and correctly. And this is something that you only learn in a workshop. If you've put a kit together, I come across this all the time. Somebody says, well, you know, my uncle made a harpsichord. Oh, really? Well, what they did is they made a kit. Okay, fine. It sounds like a harpsichord. Congratulations, that's nice. But do that 60 times. And that is where the workshop training really comes in handy. You have to, there is a certain amount of knowledge that you get from having done something a great number of times that you just don't get from having done it once or twice or 3 times. The number of very fine instruments I've seen that have been almost irrevocably damaged by well-meaning people who had absolutely no idea what they were getting into, tried to repair something or redesign, revoice an instrument, it's really sort of painful. And there's no real reason for that if there is appropriate amount of training. One of the things with apprenticeships these days is that there are, as I was saying, so few instrument builders around and so few builders that are willing to entertain apprentices. In a large degree, this is a matter of the market. The market for custom-made new instruments has really diminished since there are so many instruments that are coming on the market that were made in the last 30 or 40 years. There's no need to start building new ones. You just rebuild the old ones. Well, it always comes down to the attention to detail and that wonderful ability to have the time and the caring. You have to care about doing this or else it's, nothing's going to happen. And that attention to detail is what is really the make or break for harpsichord, for any keyboard instrument really to work well. How well you finesse these little idiosyncrasies of the action weight, of the voicing weight, the amount of energy that is the plectrum imparts to individual strings. As I've said before to various classes of students, what tells you what the instrument has to do is on the notes on the page. And particularly from some of these early French keyboard makers, keyboard composers, there are very few treatises that tell you about harpsichord technique, but the few that do uniformly talk about the lightness of the action and the lightness of the keyboard, of the musician's touch on the keys. It is also said that there is one notable treatise by François Couperin. It's the Art de toucher le clavecin. And he talks about if you do a lot of manual labor, like making harpsichords, you probably won't have the kind of touch that you need to work well on a keyboard. So the hands that play harpsichord should probably not be laying bricks in the same lifespan. But I think it is very, very true. One of the things I see with and talk about with the classes I've done at North Bennett Street has been trying to impart some of the values of that keyboard technique, where you've got this very light touch on the keys. With a piano, you're talking about 10 times the amount of physical effort that goes into making producing a tone on the keyboard. So it really does. It's an entirely different technique, and to get away with playing some of these, particularly these early French keyboard pieces, you've got to have you have to have a very good keyboard and a very well-voiced instrument and a very good touch at the keyboard. Up until the mid-90s, you could very easily find a shop-trained technician. Shop-trained as opposed to YouTube-trained. Big difference here.
Big difference.
And a shop-trained technician who would come and service your instrument. And right now, that isn't always the case. There is another side to this in that, as talking about shop-trained technicians, these are people that went through, as I did, an apprenticeship with a workshop. They were working in the shop, 40 hours a week, and they actually got, nose to grindstone with these detailed operations, and also understood why they matter. One of the other affectations of the harpsichord trade was these harpsichord kits. And if you assembled a kit, by and large, you considered yourself to be an autodidactic genius, and you could, sell yourself as doing anything. You put together a kit, and you didn't really learn anything. So I'm talking about shop-trained technicians, and that is what I'm really trying to get back into this business. There are a number of people who learned harpsichord making through that autodidactic method of assembling kits, but they didn't get the shop training, that attention to detail, and why that detail is so important, and how to reproduce it. Well, that's my mission. Well, my hope for what the future holds for what I've been doing for these 52 years is really that not necessarily that somebody's going to come along and look at what I'm doing and start making their own harpsichords. The market will find the next harpsichord builders. At the moment, there really aren't any. But my hope for what I'm doing in terms of passing along the trade is to educate people who are willing and capable of doing the maintenance and the really getting down to the very skills of what keeps a harpsichord going. This requires both looking at what was made in the 20th century as well as what was made in earlier centuries. In other words, doing the R&D as I did on the original antiques, which affects almost everything that the instrument needs. I remember that day pretty well too.
Yeah, it's pretty memorable when you hit your mentor or teacher on the knuckles with it.
Well, I remember the look on his face. He just sort of drew this breath, and he was about. There was an expletive just, got right up to there, and this one went back down.
He probably also.
Let's try that again.
That you'll never do it again.
Oh boy, I didn't never do it again. But he also figured out.